Okay, yeah. So this is people have used randomness for all sorts of things. So this is an old model of river networks, which I did my PhD on branching networks in general, to be honest. So let me just talk about some of this quickly. So the idea is you just flip coins, and this is on a triangular grid, right? So, and draw a line depending on whether you get head or tail, and then just connect it all up. So the flow is going in this direction. So it's not a particularly complicated looking river network structure, but it has all the scalings of real river networks, which remains somewhat of a enigmatic thing, right? Like how universal are branching network structures sculpted into the earth from the various processes, right? Erosion, and there's diffusion, all sorts of things. Okay, so if you look at this, you think about this, well, actually the boundaries of these basins, right? Here's a little basin. The boundaries of these basins are actually two random walks. So what we get now is we start to think about two random walks hitting each other. So that's a sort of a slight variation of what we had. We had really a random walk hitting a line, right? We have a line, and we worry about the random walk hitting that line. So random walk boundaries, now we have a slightly different thing. If we've got two random walks going like this, then there's a quarter of a chance that they get further away from each other, and then half a chance that they travel at the same, they make the same jumps, and then -1 they can come together. So you have a slightly different random walk. So you can subtract one random walk from the other, and it has a slightly different property, but it's still, there's this kind of quiescent thing where it'll just sort of sit a little bit, and then, so half the time it's random walking. Okay, it's like probabilistic pauses, but it's still a first return problem. So that's nice. It's a nice thing to do. And so we have this. So this actually turns out to be true. So for basins in general, there's a scaling for them, and it's L to the minus gamma in general, because you go to different places in the world and look at satellite pictures and so on, images of continents. You'll get out these scalings. They're quite fairly. They're robust within basins, but they can vary a little bit. But they're all between 1 and 2, these scalings. So they're typically of this sort of infinite mean nature. And we know famously that the landscapes have this kind of fractal scaling, beautiful sort of structure, and that's one of the measures of it. There are many others. So this is the generalization. What's perhaps surprising about the random walk one is it doesn't have exponents that match up with the real world because it's a little too separated from it. But the way it has all of the right sort of signatures in terms of scaling. I mean, it has these scalings. And on top of that, the way they're related to each other matches up with the real world. So if we'll call that one gamma. I know we've got lots of gammas, but this is consistent with it. So then we can do some other things for our random walk one. We've got a basin of length L. Well, the typical width, and this is just straight out of the standard deviation growing like sigma growing like t to the half that we had earlier on. So we're going to say that, right? So our basins are going to hit each other, and then roughly, within this length, there's going to be a typical width of L to the half. It's just a rough scaling. So we can say the basin area will scale like this, L to the 3/2. That has if we turn that around, that connects to a famous, I'll have it on some other slides, but this is L. This is kind of a weird way of expressing it, but L is proportional to A to the 2/3. So this isn't working. This doesn't work with dimensional analysis, right? There's something funny about this. This is Buckingham pi is not quite happy about this. But the area is, length squared, and this is just length. This is not right. So that was this early sort of 50s finding that things are maybe a bit strange about with how these networks fit together, and it's not just this is branching networks writ large. So it turns out the scalings you see for river networks have some sympathy to the scaling of for blood networks, for example, right? So the things sitting inside us have some similar kind of things. And in fact, the so-called Horton laws, which were published by or named after a famous hydrologist, Robert Horton, who published work in the 40s, they're used to describe blood networks. Right, they use exactly the same approach. It's sort of the first area of people thinking about fractals or quantifying fractals. Yes?
Just curious if you could comment on, so if the length to width ratio is that, how does the whole area get covered? You just have
Yeah, how do you fit all these things together? So they are. So that picture you get, it's not obvious really, and I don't think I have a clear way of saying to you that it must work. I mean, from that pure random network one, the random walk one, you can see how they're going to actually fit together just by construction, right? I mean, every point has drainage coming out of it, so by construction it has to work. I mean, it means that if you've got this basin here, it's not independent to this one here, right? So that if you really start to think about adjacent basins, that's going to be more complicated. Two basins next to each other, they share a boundary in the middle, so you'd have to think about that more carefully. But if you just say, okay, here's an infinite line, that's like a big drainage thing, and I'm just going to start at one basin, then you can do that independently. And then you say, okay, the ensemble has this behavior. It means, I should say this, it means that it's getting longer and thinner, which is true of, like, the allometric scaling here is that these things are getting longer and thinner, which may hold up for a little while, but it can't be true at the largest scale, which is always fine. Helpful? Okay. Oh, well. Or stop talking. Okay, so we can convert between them. We have a probability distribution for L, and this is leading into a piece that I want to do, just variable transformation later on. Simple statistical thing, but has some nice power, and it'll help us when we get to forest fires and other things later on. So if this is the relationship between them, lots of proportionals, so then DL is just a simple thing, right? We're just going to differentiate this. A to the minus a third, 2/3 comes out the front, dA, so that's our little differentials. And then we're just going to convert between these probability distributions. So probability of A dA equals probably L dL, right? They're the same basins. We had L to the minus 3 R halves dL, and then we're going to replace these pieces with what we know. So dL gets replaced by this blob, and this is the connection between, right, so I guess we'll do L is A to the 2/3. We'll stick A to the power of 2/3 in there. Right, so that's what happens, right? So L, here it is. L is A to the 2/3. We're going to go plonk, and there's a minus 3 halves. That's that power. And then the DL, the little differential, again, it's all proportionals, gets replaced by this A to the minus a third dA. This is just a constant. Okay, then we can group things together. You can see this cancels this. This is A to the minus 1, and then A to the minus a third, so it's going to be A to the minus 4/3 dA. So another one of these scalings, a little more extreme, actually. It's closer to 1, right, which is, when things go completely off the reservation. Makes sense. Areas, length squared, right, so they're bigger things, so you expect there may be a heavier tail for this, yeah. But that scaling holds up in real world ones as well. So that's usually called tau. So you can do connections between them. These are some real world observations. You can see they're quite rough. They do include random networks, but not super well. So this is Hack's law, as I said. This is from the 50s or late 50s. Length of these things is proportional A to the H. And so you'd think this should be a half, right? Dimensional analysis, this would be a half, right? Length is area to the half. And it's actually true that for really large networks, it seems to be 0.5. So this seems to be an area of science where people got really excited about an anomalous scaling. That's a term that that's often used by physicists, anomalous scaling, right? Something that doesn't come out in a very simple, not the obvious thing, which would be a half here. But actually, turns out that large basins, once we got enough data that's there. So it may be that smaller basins have this allometry as well. So, of course, there are models that have very non-trivial ones, as I just showed you, right? So A to the 2/3, and lots of other systems that can do it. So you can do this in general. I'll just quickly show this. We don't have to go on with it too much. But we could just start with these general things. We don't know exactly what they are. A to the H, A to the minus tau, L to the minus gamma. And you go through that same calculation, right? It's the same thing. And what pops out is, right, we started with length, we went to area, so it's going to come through with a gamma, and the connection is this H from Hack's exponent. That the exponent for area, for the area distribution, is related to the connecting exponent H, which is here, for Hack's law, and the exponent for length in this way. So let's see, 3 halves, for example, -1 is a half, and a half times 2/3 is a third, so 1 plus a third. That's what we had for random behavior. So all of this is to show a number of things, but this is an important one. These are one of these scaling relations, right? So at this point we say, well, we only need 2 of these, right? Because the third one should be governed by these other 2. So when we look at real networks, these scaling relations hold up, even though the numbers are different. So that's a nice thing to have found out of a toy model. So as this is the term, scaling relations, lots of systems have them. And part of the game for some of these systems is to reduce to the bare minimum that you need to describe the system. So I don't have these slides, but there are many. Over the years, people, especially for river networks, produce like 15 or so scalings of all kinds of things. And you could really get it down. You can boil it down to maybe 2 exponents actually really mattering. So more work, and you couldn't do it from what we just did there, but more work shows that this is in fact true, right? That there's actually collapses even further. So this is 2/3 inverted, gives you 3 halves. 2/3 here gives you 4/3, which was what we had. No, that's just the case of the so-called Scheidegger networks, the random walk ones. So that's a step forward, right? There's more work to be done this is, we're not going through how we got to this, but there's a different sort of primal approach that gets you there. So that's always good, that's an improvement on what we had before. 1 exponent simplifies the system description, if it's true, and then you expect to see these scaling relations as long as you have good scaling in general. Okay. Then there's finally a nice thing here where it may be that you have one universal kind of structure or system, but you may have different universality classes, and that seems to be something of the case maybe for these networks. There isn't a smooth tuning. For example, you can't have we don't seem to see every exponent between 2/3 and a half, right? There are some separated kinds of systems. We'll see variations on that when we get to networks. For the rich get richer story, they can be actually really tunable.